Hi, my name is Stephen Byrns. I'm president of the Untermyer Gardens Conservancy, and I want to speak to you today about the architect of Untermyer Gardens, William Welles Bosworth. Bosworth was born in 1869 in Marietta, Ohio. His family was an old family there. It was a small town, but there's some interesting old houses that still today are known as Bosworth houses. So he came from a prominent family in a very small town. This fuzzy image shows you what some of the landscape of Ohio was like around that time in the late 19th century. This is where the oil industry really got started, especially with the beginning of Standard Oil Company in Cleveland with John D. Rockefeller. Bosworth, at a young age, 16, came to Boston, where he matriculated at MIT and studied architecture. He there was very influenced by the new building, the construction of the Mead great public library there. He then went to Europe and met with a number of people and traveled widely, including meeting the famous watercolorist Lawrence Alma-Tadema in London. This is a picture of Lawrence's showing a classical theme. He then matriculated at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, where he really supercharged his architectural education. He came back to America and worked for a little while at the office of Richardson, and also worked on the plans of the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, the St. Louis World's Fair, and was known for his prowess in watercolors and in rendering. In fact, was engaged by Cram and Goodhue for this rendering for the competition, which they won at West Point. What was interesting is that when Bosworth sort of hung up his shingle, he had gotten married, and his wife's father was an interesting man, an Episcopalian priest who had a house in Scarborough, which is up on the Hudson River north of Tarrytown. And my guess is that through his father-in-law, he got to know some people who lived around there, one of whom was a man named V. Everett Macy, who was independently wealthy, whose father was an early investor in the Standard Oil Company, and who had a large mansion in Scarborough. And Bosworth did a design for a garden for him, for which no record exists, unfortunately. But Macy was a kind of a popular guy up in Scarborough. And through Macy, Bosworth met Frank Vanderlip, who is the president of the New York City Bank, now Citibank. And Vanderlip had a mansion that he had bought in Scarborough, and became very interested in dealing with William Welles Bosworth. There was a building down on Wall Street, which was called the Merchants Exchange, designed by Isaiah Rogers in the early 19th century, which had magnificent columns in front of it, which you can see here. It was, I guess, a 3 or 4 story building. Then the Bank of the City of New York bought the building, and they doubled it in size, hiring Mead to design the upper levels. And this building looks like this right now on Wall Street. However, what was interesting, and from the original design, you can see in the front porch, there were a row of columns that went deep into the facade. And there were, when they renovated it, Mead, there were a couple of extra columns that were no longer needed because the porch was shallower. And so Vanderlip got them and hired Bosworth to design the main gates and elements of his mansion in Scarborough. So here are actually those 2 early 19th century monolithic columns sunk into the ground at least halfway. And these are now visible on Broadway in Scarborough, and this beautifully detailed iron classical gate from the original entrance to the mansion. The mansion was a pre-existing wooden building to which Bosworth made a number of additions, including this sort of whimsical rooftop solarium, which he did in a number of other instances you'll see throughout, not only here, but elsewhere. He erected a pair of large rooms to the side of the mansion, which was a library. And you can see the octagonal building on the right, which is very interestingly completely revealed on the outside, including how it intersects with the main rectangular form, which is also a library. Notice what's on the rooftop above there. So Vanderlip had a number of children, and he built this little structure up above as a little classroom or a place for his children to play. And again, this shows Bosworth's experimentation with larger bands of glass and building these sort of light-filled rooms. Again, you can see the main facade here, the octagon revealed on the left and the big room on the right. This is the room, which is the octagonal room. Bosworth was very taken by this sort of shell motif, which you can see in the thermal semicircular windows. And what's interesting to me is that the detailing on the bookshelves is extremely simple. And this goes to part of what was distinctive about Bosworth, in that he did not go overboard with ornamentation. He was interested in sort of a simplified version of classicism. This is the skylight, again with that shell motif in that octagonal room. This is the large room, showing the mantle, again with beautifully detailed columns. Notice the stucco ceiling with classical figures. He was very, very taken by classicism, which was, of course, very popular at the time. Opposite that, again, these high windows with the shell motif. This is looking out towards the river. These beautiful circular windows framing the Palladian motif. Nearby was a garage building. You'll see over and over again that Bosworth really went whole hog with using columns and pilasters. So this is a carriage house with the 3 garage doors. And as you turn the corner on it, you see the pilasters go all the way around the building. Nearby was a service building that was, I don't know, was a gardener's shed, but it was part of the estate. And again, another one of these interesting sort of quirky all glass rooms at the top of the building, providing a way to look out toward the river. Vanderlip also asked Bosworth, very importantly, to design his garden. And so these elements remain: a big circular pool here, a loggia beyond, and then sort of a temple down toward the end. This is in the loggia with sort of a lattice motif or a Roman grill, looking either side on these loggias. So this would have been, a very sort of high style, Beaux-Arts, classically inspired garden. Also through Vanderlip, he was involved across the river in supporting the development of Letchworth Village, which was a huge hospital complex for children with mental disabilities. And Bosworth was again, fairly young man, entrusted to design this. It's ruined today, and many of the buildings have been lost. But through Macy and through Vanderlip, Bosworth then made the acquaintance of John D. Rockefeller Jr. And it was this relationship that was to really alter very profoundly the rest of his career. Interestingly, I would say about 7 years ago, I reached out to David Rockefeller, who was almost 100 years old at the time. I had never met him, but I asked him if he was interested to visit the garden here at Untermyer Gardens. He said absolutely yes. He came in a wheelchair, he walked around in a walker, and he remembered Bosworth, and he had always wanted to see the garden, and then invited me over to his house for lunch afterwards. And this was a record of that lovely lunch and day with David Rockefeller. Junior, I'll call Junior as John D. Rockefeller Jr., the son, was in charge of the construction of his parents' country house Kykuit in Scarborough. This is an elevated view of it now. And the architects for the house were originally Delano and Aldrich, with Bosworth designing the garden. So Rockefeller had seen Vanderlip's garden and said, this is the guy for me. So he designed a number of elements all around the estate. This was actually a swimming pool, beautiful mosaic on the bottom. You could see this rough stonework at the back, again, evocative of some of the elements at Untermyer Gardens. This pavilion down near the pool is very similar to pavilions that were built later here in Yonkers. This is looking down towards a tea pavilion. Notice there's a central rill with a pathway on either side with little water jets going down, again, which was realized much more fully and monumentally at Untermyer. Interestingly, behind that tea pavilion, on the other side of it, on the east side of it, is an ancient column made of Cipollino marble. And unbelievably, we at Untermyer have a pair of ancient Roman columns in Cipollino marble. There's a circular temple, which has a classical sculpture which is not very visible in front of that column. Also on the cross axis at Kykuit. And so there are formal elements to the garden, but then there's sort of more rustic or informal elements of the garden. This is under that temple, a sort of grotto made with very rough hewn stone and very evocative of sort of a subterranean world. And not far from that is this sort of boulder-esque fantasy, which I would not be surprised was designed by the same mason, Carlos Davite, who did the Temple of Love at Rockefeller Gardens. So this was the house that Delano and Aldrich built for John D. Rockefeller Sr. So the house was built, and very odd sort of arts and crafts style, maybe you'd say, sort of Germanic. And there were all kinds of problems from the very beginning. It had been under construction for a number of years, but the fireplaces didn't draw. They got smoky inside. You can see the third floor is under the attic. It was very, very tight. And, you know, they had a large family and they had visitors and other people coming by. And it was really perceived to be fairly disastrous and needed to be remodeled, you know, to remodel a brand new house. So here you can see on the right, upper right, what Delano and Aldrich's house looked like. And then you can see in the center what became of it. So the third floor became a total full third floor, and then another floor above that, much grander, much more classical. And Bosworth, it was Bosworth who was brought in to help Delano and Aldrich, who I'm sure were not happy to share the spotlight with Bosworth, but to achieve the house that we see today, which is magnificent. And you can see the beautiful sculptures on the pediment, which was something that I think Bosworth fought for. While he was kind of restrained in his use of ornament, he was a big believer in sculpture and was a great patron of sculptors. At the same time that the house was built, Bosworth felt that the approach to the house should be really larger. It was on this bit of a hill, had a great view of the river, but was set back quite a ways from the river. So huge amounts of soil were trucked in to make the hilltop bigger, which you see now. And this terrace was greatly enlarged with huge retaining walls coming down. If you see the fountain on the main level, that is based on the fountain of Oceanus at the Boboli Gardens. More on that later. These beautiful stairs, monumental stairs going down. There's the fountain of Oceanus, the stairs going down to another beautiful sculpture of Adam and Eve by what was his name? Barnard, George Gray Barnard. Near to the bottom of that is another beautiful pavement with sort of this pebbled pathway in a mosaic sort of design. I believe also probably by Carlos Davite, who did the pebbled pathways at the Frick Museum, as well as the Temple of Love at Untermyer. So I just want to get in. So Bosworth did, all of the garden design pretty much at Kykuit. He worked on the refashioning and the restatement of what the mansion looked like. So just to dig a little more deeply into some interesting coincidences here. And we're looking at the Fifth Avenue at the turn of the century and East 54th Street. So if you look at this map here, you can see the original St. Thomas Church before it burned down on the corner of 53rd and 5th. Above it were two very large mansions that were Vanderbilt mansions. And then to the left of that, you see the green rectangle and then a freestanding house. That was opposite a hospital on the north side. And that became the residence of John D. Rockefeller Sr. He did not build it, he bought it, and he lived there for much of the rest of his life. To the east side of Fifth Avenue, there were a row of houses between 53rd and 54th Street. And if you look at the northeast corner of 54th Street, you'll notice there's another interesting thing there. So this is a photograph of what that street looked like on the east side of Fifth Avenue. On the corner, at the time of this photograph, was the James Pyle house, which later became the house of David McAlpin. Next door to him was Samuel Untermyer. Next door to him was Cornelius Vanderbilt. Next door to him, ironically and interestingly to me, was a very distant ancestor of mine named Levi Morton, whose house was designed by McKim, Mead and White. At the corner was Charles Harkness of the Harkness family. Again, the Harknesses were early investors in Standard Oil, became fabulously wealthy, and were major benefactors of Yale University. On the far corner was the residence of William Rockefeller, John D. Rockefeller's brother. So you'll hear a little bit more about William Rockefeller, but here we have Samuel Untermyer. Untermyer was a lawyer for William Rockefeller, and again, William Rockefeller was just a half a block away from his brother, John Rockefeller. So they all lived right near each other. This shows a picture of the current St. Thomas Church after it was rebuilt by Cram and Goodhue after the fire. Here you can see on 54th Street, John D. Rockefeller Sr.'s house, and then next to it, Junior decided he would build a house for his family, and he had a bunch of kids. And this was known as the tallest, the largest mansion in New York City. And this was built in 1911 by 213 by Bosworth. So again, Bosworth had become very close to Junior, and so he designed their house, which looked like that. It had again, Bosworth loved using rooftops. He put these solariums up on top. So here's a playground for the kids up on the roof. But again, interesting, looking at the facade here, he really likes showing the different sort of priorities and uses of what's happening inside, manifesting it on the outside. So you see a very large second floor space, and the third floor is sort of medium-sized windows, and the fourth floor is very small windows, then it gets big again, then small and small. So there's this variation and modulation in the facade that relates to the interior usage. So this shows the Fifth Avenue frontage. Again, John D. Rockefeller's house senior was to the right. On the left is the old St. Thomas Church, and these were the two Vanderbilt mansions that were on Fifth Avenue. But as we know, Fifth Avenue started changing. People were, the mansions were being torn down, commercial buildings were being put up. People were getting very upset about this. So what happened was the first Vanderbilt mansion on the one on the left next to the church came down, and and Junior wound up buying it. And what he did was he hired Bosworth to design a tasteful, not residential building, but commercial building. So Bosworth designed this building right next to the new St. Thomas Church. And again, on the corners, you can see the next Vanderbilt mansion that was about ready to come down, and Bosworth completed that. So again, Rockefeller and Junior working together. This is an interesting building that was the New York Association for the Blind on East 59th Street, where they are now, also designed in 1911 by Bosworth. And again, you can see this variation from floor to floor of sort of the more important floors and the less important floors. And again, the sense that there's something up there on the roof with the open railing. So coming back to Scarborough, what's interesting in 1913, 1 or 2 years later, is Vanderlip decided to build a private school for his children and for children of the neighborhood. And what does he do? He hires Bosworth to design the Scarborough School, again in a very sort of restrained classicism. Notice the use of columns in the front doorway on the center, and above it a big glazed room, which is a library, and classrooms on the left and a gym on the right. So those are the classrooms on the left. Those are the classrooms expressed on the back of the building. Again, the pilasters, and you can see the grouping of the class. You can read each classroom individually within the grid of the columns. Then a theater was built behind the building, a very sort of bold, almost expressionistic massing with the tall fly space above the stage, interestingly expressed. On the side of the building, there are definitely losses here. There was windows that have been filled in, there were sculptural elements, but there's almost kind of a simple, restrained, cubic almost massing of the elements on the north side, right side of the building. Here we see coming in through the outer columns into the vestibule, there are inner columns and then a glazed area behind that. We'll see him doing this again in the AT&T building with the outer columns and the inner columns. You pass through those doors and there's another screen of pilasters inside the main lobby. There are, again, Bosworth really tried to employ sculptors as much as possible. And so we have reliefs above the doorways. This is the doorway on the right into the theater. Look at this. This is the hallway on the left where the classrooms were. So the classroom doors were below. In the middle level were screens that allowed for cross ventilation to cool the rooms from one side to the other. And then there's this narrow band of clerestory windows on top to bring light, natural light, into the corridor. Those windows are not visible on the facade. They're sort of tucked in there, but he very ingeniously inserts light wherever possible. This is a photograph of the theater in the center of the building. Again, these tall space, and look at the windows, again with that shell motif, alternating with the Greek cross. And the seats as well are original to the theater designed by Bosworth. Then off to the side is the stair that takes you up to the second floor where the library is and a couple of other offices. Again, extremely simple. So he sometimes really went whole hog into a very restrained, almost modern aesthetic. Then when we come up to the second floor, we come into the library. And again, he's really fully exploring the use of color in his architecture. And remember that those who really know their Greek architecture, which Bosworth did, that the buildings which you see now as white were painted, and he very much wants to introduce that element of color into his architecture. So these are the ceilings, which has stencils, the panels above the bookshelves up near the ceiling all have these, again, Greek-inspired artwork. So that's the Scarborough School. Around the same time, in Washington, D.C., again, McKim, Mead, White, and other architects through the Macmillan Plan were looking at how to enrich Washington, D.C. to bring to fruition its monumental potential, which was intended by the Pierre L'Enfant, who designed the street plan for Washington. And so one of the things they decided to do was to reinter Pierre L'Enfant in Washington. He had been buried somewhere else. I don't know where it was. They exhumed his body. They brought him over, and Bosworth was hired to design his tomb. And it's in Arlington Cemetery on top of the hill overlooking the city, beautifully detailed underneath. You can see sort of the sword with the intertwined oak leaves, and the top of this slab shows the urban plan of Washington, D.C., designed by L'Enfant. And this shows you this is the great Lee Mansion on top of the hill. And it's right in front of there. So the next time you go to the Lee Mansion in Arlington Cemetery, you can see that tomb that was designed by Bosworth. So Bosworth, again, really knew his stuff. This is a rendering of the Septizodium, which was in Rome, right near the Colosseum. And it was really almost sort of a billboard of a building. It was designed to impress people when they approached the Forum. And it was this stack of columns going up, up, up. So very, very grand, impressive building with not a definitive function. So Bosworth, through his connection, obviously, with Rockefeller, became acquainted with Theodore Vail, V-A-I-L, who was the president of AT&T. So AT&T, we're talking 1912 to 1916, was like, Amazon or Tesla or whatever, a major sort of cutting edge industry, Apple, that was, generating huge profits through new technology, the telephone. And so they wanted to build their corporate headquarters in a very prominent location just south of City Hall in New York City. This is a great monument and landmark in New York City, designed by Bosworth. And so Bosworth was influenced by that image of the Septizodium to build a building that was a stack of columns. Each order of columns was 3 stories, so 3, 3, 3, 3 going up. And what's interesting to me is the way this building, he's expressing the steel. So this is a steel frame building, and the steel, it's not a wall bearing structure at all. It's these point loads that are coming down where the columns are. So he's really overtly expressing the skeletal nature of the structure on the exterior. If you notice to the right is a campanile, which obviously a very tall, slender tower on which there is a ziggurat, which we'll be seeing multiple times later in his career. And on top of that was originally a famous sculpture. And I just wanted to contrast that to another building built around the same time by M.I.T, the municipal building nearby, in which the walls are shown in a more planar fashion, looking more like a wall bearing. So again, Bosworth, even though he's working within the classical idiom, I would argue is being more modern in showing the skeletal nature of the structure. So this shows you, again, back to the AT&T building, that campanile on the right and the main part of the building on the left. The building wasn't built all at once, it was built in sections, but this tower was actually one of the first things that was built. And what I like is how he articulates the difference between the tower on the right with the main block of the building on the left with a reveal to really sort of make them breathe separately from each other. This was the sculpture that was on top of that tower when the Philip Johnson's AT&T building headquarters was built on 55th Street and Madison Avenue. That sculpture was in that lobby. But then AT&T moved yet again to New Jersey, so it's now at their corporate headquarters in New Jersey. So this is the other side of the facade. And again, sort of an interesting thing is a classical group of columns, surely where there's a pediment, has an even number of columns so that the center is an open bay. But here we have 5 columns in which the center is a column. So it's sort of a perverse thing, but again, playing around with the conventions of classicism. Again, he really loved to bring in sculpture. He had a close relationship with Paul Manship, which of course he used along at Untermyer. And Manship did these beautiful reliefs of the four elements. This is fire, the other one was water. At the AT&T building. Here again, you see the columns on the outside being brought in the grid going onto the inside. So it's like this forest of columns from the outside into the inside. One of the most beautiful lobbies in all of New York, if not the most beautiful lobby. Beautiful lighting, all intact. Look at the gorgeous detail work of these sort of starbursts in the coffers of the ceiling. This is, again, elements in the lobby that were designed by him, this mailbox, even the stairs going up very classically, but very discreetly and simply designed. Another mailbox, another bronze door. This is an interesting photograph here. Let me get my notes here. This is a photograph in 1915, and on the left is William Welles Bosworth. Next to him is Trowbridge, a well-known architect. Then there's Vail, who is the president of AT&T, standing next to him. And then seated on the chairs are, on the left, J.P. Morgan Jr., and then on the right, William Rockefeller. And this was at his Jekyll Island clubhouse to witness the first transatlantic phone call. And again, this shows Bosworth there. He was very close. He designed the AT&T building, and he later designed William Rockefeller's tomb, as well as Rockefeller's apartment at Jekyll Island. So through, again, what his connection at Rockefeller, he met Richard McLaurin, who is the president of MIT. And it was a long story, but eventually Bosworth was hired to design the campus for MIT in Cambridge. And it was based on the model of a German university where the buildings were all sort of interconnected, as opposed to the American model, Harvard, Princeton, Yale, whatever, you have these separate buildings. So on the left, this is the plan, this is the original plan. Those were all the classroom and administrative buildings on the left half, which face the river, which is on the bottom of the drawing. And the right hand of the campus faced the other way, away from the river towards the athletic fields, and that was to have more of the dormitories. The right-hand section was really never really built as planned, but the left-hand section was. Here you can see an elevation of it with its beautiful dome, sort of a foggy picture, but back in the day, before, there have been a lot of modern buildings put around it that sort of distract from the purity of the original design. And again, this great central building with a beautiful dome. You know, if you compare this campus to, say, Columbia University, designed by McKim, Mead, and White, its central building was also a library, had a pediment. This has no pediment. It's just sort of screen of columns, and which gives much more prominence to the dome. And here, if you look carefully, what's interesting is what Bosworth did is the library was only at the very upper part of the building. So the top 4 through 5, 6 floors was where the library was, and there were office buildings, offices below. And if you look carefully, you can see little areas where he was able to sneak in light just below the dome in front of a cornice to bring in light, but he elevates the dome. Here we are inside with this beautiful coffering and a magnificent skylight at the top, looking here with the beautiful palmettes forming the border of the bottom of the dome. So if you look at the dome on the right, there's that stepped portion coming, and then there's sort of like a shadowy ring going around, and that's actually skylights in there. And then you get the drum or the cylinder of the dome, which again is circular, the base of the dome, and at the bottom of that are more little windows, again letting in light, and then it expands out to the main box of the columns framing the courtyard. If you look towards the river, you could see those 4 little towers, again with the ziggurats Ziggurat was a repeating motif in Bosworth's work. And again, what's interesting is you look at, again, one of the other notable domes by John Russell Pope at the National Gallery in Washington, again with the pediment in front, but really the dome, as nice as it is really not very visible, and it's sort of unsatisfactory, I would argue. And again, look at what Bosworth did on the left, elevating the dome and really celebrating it by separating the library from the offices below. And again, look at where the columns are. It's just 3 stories of glass. So where the floors are, structurally, there would be spandrel glass. It was opaque glass, but elsewhere there's clear glass. So it's really almost like a modern curtain wall. What's interesting is that the stepping of the walls of the campus, as you go toward the river, the orders of the pilasters are 2 stories tall. On the right, again, in the center where it says Lavoisier, it transitions from 2 stories to 3 stories. So if you look to the left, the pilasters are 3 stories. So it's giving you a greater sense of monumentality as you go to the dome. And again, there's the ziggurat on top. There's a side entrance that Bosworth did many years later, I think in the 30s, when he was living in France, but he was brought back to design another monumental building as part of the campus. This is a picture of the president's house at MIT, and again at the top is one of these rooftop structures that has a lot of glassy windows. And what was interesting is that inside MIT, it was strictly very, very simple, expressive of its reinforced poured concrete structure. So again, really almost an industrial aesthetic on the inside of these classroom buildings. So again, a few years later, Bosworth is brought in by Untermyer to design the garden that we love here in Yonkers. And I did a little checking to see, let's look at Untermyer compared to Kykuit. I went onto my computer with Google Earth, and on the left, you can see with the hatched area, that is Kykuit, the mansion, and you can see the various gardens that go around it. So Kykuit, is magnificent as it is, and as beautifully maintained as it is, beautifully designed as it is actually pretty compact. On the right is Untermyer. So the hatched portion on the lower right there is the mansion. And then to the sort of upper right, you can see the walled garden. I mean, the walled garden itself is almost as big as Kykuit. You see the stairs going down, the vista going down, and other elements of the garden. And by the way, this, where you see sort of arrows shown and dashed lines, those are parts of the garden that no longer exist. So the garden as designed by Bosworth was even bigger than what's shown. And what I'm trying to show is that the design of the garden, again, Temple of Love, very close to the Greystone mansion of Untermyer. So what I'm trying to show is how much grander a scale Untermyer is than Kykuit. So again, Bosworth was really very well educated and knowledgeable. He was aware of this book by Constance Villiers Stewart, which is the first book written in English about the gardens of India. And he looked at that very closely when he designed the walled garden at Untermyer. Xenophon, a classical writer, wrote about the gardens of Cyrus the Younger, in which he said that Cyrus the Younger had a relief of Artemis over the front door, and lo and behold, that's what Bosworth has here at Untermyer. So incredibly knowledgeable about precedents. On the left, this is the Lion's Gate in Mycenae, 1200 BC. On the right, at the main entrance at Untermyer, again referring back to this Mycenaean design. The lower gate at Untermyer in the walled garden is this interesting, quirky design where the roof is almost this tiled roof is kind of floating over this archway. I don't know exactly what its derivation is. You can't really see, but what the elements that are helping it float are made out of wood with a Greek key scroll on it. But a very interesting, almost modern type of design. The paired columns that support these sphinxes, again, Paul Manship, which he returned to time and time again, are based on the paired columns at the Boboli Gardens in Florence. And remember, the Boboli Gardens, behind those paired columns was the Fountain of Oceanus, which Bosworth put in the courtyard at Kykuit. The beautiful mosaics at the stage of the amphitheater at Untermyer are based on a temple in Tyrans in Greece, which is built around 1200 BC, Mycenaean. Again, another ancient reference. In that book about the Mughal gardens shows a photograph, not a photograph, a watercolor of the Mughal emperor sitting over a sheet of water symbolizing one of the rivers of paradise. And at Untermyer, it doesn't sadly work now, but between the columns is a slot in the stone which was a sheet of water. Again, a reference to the Mughal gardens. You can see here the great circular temple looking like a blown up version of the one at Kykuit. And the beautiful mosaics in the pool here with that ziggurat form. So ziggurats can be, rooftop forms, but also this sort of stepped form that was used at the Persian pool at Untermyer, which we will see also at the Rockefeller tomb. The stairs flanking the Temple of the Sky here are based on stairs here at the Doge's Palace in Venice. So what we're talking about in Bosworth is someone who's incredibly knowledgeable about architectural precedent, the great vista, which goes down to those ancient Roman monolithic columns made of Cipollino-like, but bigger versions than the one at Kykuit, is based on the Villa d'Este at Lake Como, another architectural reference. Those are those great ancient columns at the bottom of the vista. Off of that was the vegetable garden with, again, a very sort of quirky, sort of asymmetrical layout in the parterre bed. So again, sort of a more unusual creative use of design in the classical idiom, I would argue. These gardens are lost. These were the vegetable gardens, but the two pavilions at the top look very similar to the ones that we saw at Kykuit. The Temple of Love, again, just magnificent, rock work on steroids. Looks similar to that rock formation, man-made, that I showed you at Kykuit, which I think is based on, could be based on the Temple of the oh, I'm forgetting where it is, but this is a Fragonard drawing. This is outside of Rome. Bosworth also designed one of the most interesting memorials at Woodlawn Cemetery, which is the Bliss Memorial. Very, very free and interestingly designed. This is, you can see Grant's tomb on the left, and on the right is the International House, which is still there, designed by a different architect, but Bosworth was now in France. This was built by John D. Rockefeller Jr., who consulted with Bosworth to make sure that this had Bosworth's stamp of approval in the design. So again, this just shows the close relationship between Rockefeller and Bosworth. This is Bosworth's own house, which was built in Locust Valley in 1921. This is off of Google Earth. It was sort of in the upper part, you can see a circle. There's a pool there and a long, skinny area. Reminds you of the vista. So this was the house, again, sort of almost abstracted, a modern classical element with a scrunched pediment at the top, again, almost floating. Remember that little rooftop that floated at Untermyer Gardens? Here we have this there. And what's interesting is behind that pediment was Bosworth's studio, and there are windows on the side that you cannot see. So they're hidden windows that look out onto the flat roof that bring light into his studio. Here we are in the back. There are the arched windows of the studio here looking over the back. There's the circular pool in the foreground here. And by the way, if you look carefully on the third floor, you can see there are reliefs by Gaston Lachaise who is another of Bosworth's favorite sculptors, along with Paul Manship. And then this is the view, again, of this sort of vista going down, which reminds me of the vista at Greystone. So now we come to the William Rockefeller mausoleum, which is in Sleepy Hollow Cemetery, very close to both William Rockefeller's great house, Rockwood Hall, as well as Untermyer, John D. Rockefeller Sr.'s house, Kykuit. So over the, this is the entrance to the tomb here. The sidewalk that you can't quite see, get a sense of it, in the foreground is, I think, like 35 feet long. It is one piece of granite, huge thing to quarry, and they had to close down the streets in Tarrytown for the trucks to be able to make turning radiuses for such a long piece. The relief over the bronze door is also by Gaston Lachaise, similar to what he had at his house. And then look at the rooftop again with that ziggurat form. His love of columns all around. There's the Lachaise relief. Interesting, the stairs, again, huge monoliths, each cluster of 3 steps with the little block to the side is a single piece of stone. So 3, 3, 3, each of those are single pieces of stone. And what's interesting to me is how he expresses that on the side of the mansion. Those 3 blocks wraps all around the building, almost bringing the ziggurat down to the floor. And again, there you get almost the zigzag form of the pavement around the mausoleum reminds me of the ziggurat form of the Untermyer pool. So again, this sort of stepping form. And notice William Rockefeller's name is not above in the building in the normal place. It's off to the side in a very discreet, almost secret location. Here you see how it turns the corner, these columns going all around. So that's the William Rockefeller tomb. Bosworth closes his office in 1924 and moves to France. He marries a second time, and he does this at the behest of Junior. So when he, and I'll conclude with that in a moment, but when he was in France, he maintained close relations with what was happening in New York, and Junior, of course, built the cloisters, and Bosworth worked very closely with him on that, and he had heard about these the unicorn tapestry, Bosworth did, and he called it to attention of Junior and said, you might want to take a look at this. And so, and Rockefeller said, you think I should buy it? And he said, yes, I do. I think they're absolutely superlative and will be the treasure in your museum. So again, it shows the connection between Bosworth and Junior. He felt that before Senior died, there should be a great portrait done of him. So Bosworth recommended to Junior that he bring in John Singer Sargent to make this portrait of his father. Bosworth goes to France, and the reason he goes to France is because Junior decides after World War I, he was very interested in historic preservation. As you know, he restored Williamsburg, Virginia, but in France, he was very taken by what was, the poor conditions of monuments in France after the war. So he gave millions of dollars to restore Versailles and hired Bosworth to be in charge of this restoration project. Also, Reims Cathedral was the only Gothic cathedral in France that was bombed during World War I. This is a photograph of the bombing that took place. This is what it looked like inside. So Bosworth worked on the restoration of Reims Cathedral, also bringing in sort of innovative precast concrete structural elements to help shore it up, as well as Fontainebleau. So those 3 things were what Bosworth worked on until, so he left until he retired at age 67. And what was interesting is, when was that? It was in 1920, I guess it was in the 30s. It was in the 30s. Bosworth decided to build a house for himself in France. And again, he lived in France until he died. And again, classically inspired, but very modern in its detailing. His own bedroom was in the domed space on the second floor. And what does he call it? He calls it Villa Marietta. Marietta is where he was born in Ohio. So I think it's safe to say that Welles Bosworth operated on a high intellectual and aesthetic level as an architect, which no doubt impressed John D. Rockefeller Jr. The warmth and trust of their relationship cannot be overemphasized. Rockefeller's endorsement obviously supercharged his career, including the commission to design Samuel Untermyer's garden. It is interesting to me, a Midwesterner from Michigan, that a number of Bosworth's circle were also from the Midwest, including Rockefeller, Vanderlip, and Vail, which may have helped to form a bond between them. Bosworth's practice flourished brilliantly for 18 years, from 1906 to 1924. His work was characterized by erudite architectural references as well as creative interpretations of the classical language. There was an underlying spareness in his design and a desire to express a building's functions externally that resonate with Midwestern honesty and integrity. Think of Frank Lloyd Wright, who was his almost exact contemporary. Sadly, he took the bait from Rockefeller to move to France at age 55 to restore Versailles, Fontainebleau, and Rheims Cathedral, which were prestigious commissions. The fact that he was able to build such an impressive villa for himself in France suggests that Rockefeller made it financially worth his while to relocate. While he no doubt enjoyed the culture and riches of France for 42 years until his death at age 97, one feels a sense of loss at the projects, architectural and horticultural, that were never realized in the United States. Thankfully, we can lay claim in Yonkers for one of his masterpieces, as Untermyer Gardens manifests a masterful manipulation of space, massing, and detail. Thank you very much.